Thank you, Rosana. Well, let me start by thanking all of you for coming for this side event. It is a great pleasure for us to host this event on the margin of the T20 taking place these days here in Pretoria. And I'd like to concur with what Rosana has said, that this topic is of utmost importance for all of us, governments, civil society, all of us that are interested, and we understand that critical minerals is an asset that developing countries have, but that needs to be we need to find ways to better turn this to the benefit of our countries, and with a view to ensure energy security, to ensure just transition, to ensure that these will serve our development purposes, that we will have value, that will be inserted in a more, let's say, effective way in the global chains of value. So all of these objectives, of course, we are also talking about the effect on climate change and the benefits that can accrue from further exploration. And the reality is that this topic has been discussed in the various fora at the United Nations. We know the Secretary General has commissioned a panel on this topic, and there's a report which is very important on this, to which Brazil and others, of course, have contributed. This discussion is taking place in BRICS, in G20. It will certainly be one of the main topics at COP30 on climate change that Brazil hosts by the end of the year in Berlin. So it is a very timely discussion, and I welcome all of you. And without further ado, I'd like to turn to our panelists, and I'd like to ask you to join me in applauding this initiative.
So thank you so much. Let's start our discussion. I'll do first a little introduction of ourselves, E+ Institute. We are, we were talking today with Ambassador, we are a think and do tank from Brazil. We basically work around the theme of how to cope climate action with development, which is kind of key for us to the global south. This is key because fighting climate by increasing debt, by increasing unemployment and inequality, it's something that we cannot afford. So basically our work is around industrial decarbonization, adding value to the supply chains, and rewriting, where possible, the role that we, countries from the global south, play in this world that is becoming crazier each day, and trying to find among this new world order that is coming, what's the role that you should play. So critical minerals are key to energy transition, but it's also key for our own development. And by critical minerals, we also see an enlarged vision of critical minerals, not only the ones that we've been talking about, lithium or manganese here in South Africa, or even niobium in Brazil, but also iron ore, quartz, which is silicon, where the silicon comes from for the solar panels. So structural minerals, as we said. So around this discussion, we want to see some of the different perspectives here from the panelists around how an overview of critical minerals landscape in South Africa. And I would like to ask our speaker name, as we pronounce it in Brazil, Gerson. He has a pretty Brazilian name, but he's from Angola. Yeah, South African Angola. So I asked Gerson to give us an overview on critical minerals here in South Africa. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. So I'll just start by addressing South Africa's critical mineral landscape. So in South Africa, we play a central role in the global decarbonization process. South Africa is a leading producer of critical minerals, which are key to clean technology, as all what we refer to as clean technology, which places South Africa in a very strategic position, especially within the global energy transition. But we need to decide how we're going to manage these resources. Are they going to deliver sustainable outcomes, or are we going to repeat the past injustices? So, with reference to the variety of critical minerals that we have platinum group metals, which are PGMs. South Africa is the global leader with PGMs, right? It's mostly found within the Bushveld complex, which is a term that refers to a location within northeastern South Africa. So this is primarily Limpopo, northwest Mpumalanga, and these metals are key to reducing emissions within vehicles through their use of catalytic converters and hydrogen fuel cells. So that is their main purpose of PGMs, platinum group metals. The second one we have, which South Africa is the biggest producer of, is manganese. We are one of the biggest producers in the world, and it's used for steel production. But now, within the conversation of the just energy transition, it's being used for battery technology, which also adds some value to South Africa's strategic position within the future of energy. Thirdly, we have chromium. Chromium it's meant to make steel more durable and resistant to corrosion. South Africa has massive chromite deposits, also giving it a strong position in global supply chains with infrastructure and energy projects. And then fourth, we have vanadium. Vanadium is gaining traction, particularly within the clean energy sector. Why? Because it promotes the long use of batteries. South Africa has very strong production reserves, and it makes it a potential leader in large-scale energy storage and technologies. I just wanted to outline that South Africa also has rare earth minerals, but it's also important to emphasize that South Africa is not the only country with a vast amount of critical minerals. We also have countries like the DRC, which have cobalt, copper, Zimbabwe, which have lithium, which are also used for batteries, PGMs as well. Namibia has lithium. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire have manganese as well. So this highlights the wealth that exists within the African continent with reference to critical minerals that are used for the global energy transition. So the second point, after outlining the critical mineral landscape, I just wanted to touch on the just energy transition mechanisms and energy standards in the critical minerals development. So the main point here is, as we shift to low carbon economies, we must ensure that nobody's left behind. For countries like South Africa, a just transition means ensuring that our workers, our communities, and our ecosystems are protected, especially in mining regions. For example, my work as a community officer, I go into communities and I work with these people who are affected by mining on a daily basis. So for example, in Sekhukhune, Limpopo, which is located within the province of Limpopo, a significant hotspot for platinum and vanadium brought many consequences for the local communities living within the areas. Environmental degradation through water and air pollution was a challenge, and you'll even be surprised that social issues were also challenged. Social consequences, including rising unemployment, even gender-based violence, all came as a result of mining. These are realities that show why critical minerals governance must go hand in hand for the people that are affected. Apologies, I do have an image, so I'll just skip. I'll just go into what are some just transition mechanisms or some core pillars that inform a just transition. For transition that to be just, we need mechanisms that support those who are directly affected, as I said. This includes aligning mining, labor practices, and climate goals. We need to offer skills development. We need to ensure that communities benefit. And most importantly, they need to have a seat at the table. Participatory governance is key. Community benefit sharing models are also key. Environmental and labor standards are non-negotiable. We need to safeguard those that protect our land, water, and air, and we must guarantee fair, safe, and dignified working conditions. These standards should usually align with global ESG standards. Now, looking at some policy gaps within South Africa, South Africa does have very strong frameworks in place. We have the mining charter, we have social and labor plans. However, implementation remains uneven. Communities often lack protection and enforcement is under-resourced. However, what is promising is that South Africa has a JET investment plan now in motion, and we have a chance to strengthen justice within minerals governance, especially critical minerals governance. Some recommendations. Going forward, we must close the implementation gap between ministries, labor, mining, and climate. Those groups cannot work in silos. They have to work together. And dialogues such as this one, where Brazil and South Africa having a dialogue offer real potential for shared learning and cooperation. Brazil and South Africa not only share minerals and markets, we share values. And if we align our efforts on just energy transition, environmental standards, and local empowerment, we can help redefine what development looks like, especially with the emergence of critical minerals. Thank you.
Gerson, thank you so much. By fault, I did not introduce you. Gerson is from the Southern Africa Resource Watch, and he's a junior project officer working directly with communities. Sorry, my mistake. I did not introduce you properly before. And your works is like exactly aligned with what we think could be a cooperation among ourselves, especially because we have to sit together in negotiation tables in the G20 breaks and even at COP30, and also trying to strengthen our position by better negotiating the supply chains involving critical minerals, because they do not come cost-free. Mining is something that is really complicated. Water resources are needed. It's not easy from the community side. It's not easy from the environmental side. So if we are to cause all those troubles can and should be something that adds value to our society and not only trouble. So with this, Ricardo, I would love to hear also your perspective. Ricardo is second secretary at the Brazilian Embassy in Pretoria and heads the energy sector. So now I did the introduction in a proper way. So Ricardo, please, I would love to see the overview of critical minerals coming from the Brazilian Embassy and from a just transition perspective.
First, good afternoon. First, I want to greet Ambassador Benedito, on whose behalf I greet all members of the diplomatic corps here, and on Rosana's behalf, I greet civil society present here today. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope that, while Brazil has been a powerful and a strong voice in these discussions, and we should hope to keep so and to move things forward. It is definitely a privilege to address everyone here today in this opening panel as we explore the evolving landscape of critical minerals in both Brazil, South Africa, and why not include the whole African continent. There are opportunities for our nations to collaborate in shaping a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient future. Brazil possesses significant and diverse mineral resources with great potential. Besides iron ore, which is the leader of our mineral production, accounting for more than 90% of our output, our country also exploits graphite, lithium, nickel, phosphate, titanium, and uranium. We are also the world's leading producer of niobium, responsible for 92% of global output. South Africa, has vast reserves of platinum group minerals, as my colleague has stated here before. Both nations possess not only abundant geological wealth, but also mature mining sectors and institutional expertise. And I think this is the main idea that should encompass the cooperation and collaboration that we look for. We, as Brazil, definitely congratulate South Africa's presidency of the G20 for putting critical minerals among its top priorities. It was, in our opinion, smart. This offers a timely platform for collaboration, not only between Brazil and South Africa, but also among all the G20 countries. Together, we believe we're partners in creating a more diversified and resilient global supply of critical minerals. However, resource abundance must go hand in hand with responsibility. The energy transition must be just. This means not only low carbon, but also equitable. As outlined in the Paris Agreement, a just transition calls for the development of national and regional strategies to guide the shift towards a sustainable climate-neutral economy. This process involves not only adapting to new realities and addressing environmental goals, but also building resilience, modernizing economic and social development policies, and creating opportunities for everyone. Therefore, a just transition has to ensure that this shift towards a greener economy does not overburden vulnerable populations. Its aim must be, as ILO has proposed, to maximize the social and economic benefits of climate action while minimizing challenges through social dialogue and respect for labor rights. In order to make this just transition, our government seeks to update regulatory frameworks to better reflect sustainable mining standards and adopt practices that simplify and expedite licensing procedures. In addition to this, we firmly believe that developing our resources is not only about extraction, but also about value creation through local processing, international cooperation, capacity building, technology transfer, and investment in innovation. Finally, we recognize a great potential of cooperation in mining and oil. In 2023, Petrobras, our big oil company, has expanded its presence in South Africa, Namibia, and São Tomé. We recently took notice of South Africa's interest in partnering with Brazil in the Mandela Mining Precinct to develop and deploy advanced technologies that support efficiency, safety, and sustainability in mining. During the 7th Brazil-South Africa Joint Committee, Brazil highlighted its position as a major oil producer and expressed interest in collaborating with South Africa in the sector, further collaborating. As a part of our broader commitment to deepening ties across the African continent, we see valuable opportunities to strengthen our bilateral relationship with South Africa alongside our growing partnerships with other African countries, not just in extraction, but across the entire range. We believe that there is a great potential in collaboration since our clean energy matrix gives us environmental advantage for sustainable mining processing. In this time of global transformation, Brazil and Africa have the opportunity and responsibility to lead by example. Let us work together to build supply chains that are open, resilient, and equitable. Let us ensure that the energy transition is not only about minerals and energy, but also about justice, inclusion, and shared prosperity. Together, we can transform the promise of critical minerals into real and lasting development for our peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. I think the big question in the room, and I hope by the end of this discussion we come up with some ideas, is how to implement what you just said. Both countries, South Africa and Brazil, and other African countries, they do have a lot of potential. But these potential is just a comparative advantage if we do not turn that into a competitive advantage. And in order to turn into a competitive advantage, we have to work together so that we do not go forward the way we got to where we are today. So we have to have and do something different. So hopefully, in the last session of the panel, with the cooperation with the audience, we come up with some ideas how to do different, how to propose something that is not exactly what we did today. With this, Tracy, I ask you to give you also your perspective on, especially on what is just transition in this, what is your perspective? So you've been working the concept of just transition and just transition policy and how to better understand this concept for some time now. So I'll introducing Tracy, she's a dear friend for a while now. So Tracy, where is you? Just for me to, yeah, this is Tracy. Tracy works for PARI, South Africa, and she leads the Just Transition program at PARI and holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Witwatersrand. Yeah. So, and we are together part of the INET, which is the International Network for Energy Transition Think Tanks. So this is how I first met Tracy, and then in several events around the globe. So I would love to hear your perspective on how to connect those topics with your work and your thoughts.
Thanks, Rosana. I'm going to sit here if nobody minds. So I think, we use this term just transition and say that we're developing policy within a just transition framework. Energy transition and water transition is taking place within a just transition framework. But what do we actually mean by a just transition? And what are the implications for that about how we design policy? How do we follow through with a just transition in everything that we're doing? And what we have in the world at the moment is we have a narrow definition of what constitutes a just transition, which is the dominant definition. And then there's a broader definition, which I do believe we all should be aspiring to. So a narrow definition of a just transition is what we usually hear, which is about justice in the transition itself. In the process of moving from A to B, how do we make that process just? And that is about ensuring that people are not left behind, who will lose their jobs in sectors that are changing. How do we minimize the environmental impacts of that change and those similar concerns? All of those are obviously necessary. We need to ensure that people who are employed in the coal sectors and carbon heavy industries are considered and taken care of in what we do in the future. But that is not sufficient for us to achieve all of the ideals that, let's use a different one. That narrow definition of a just transition is not sufficient to get us to all of the goals that we're looking for. So we start thinking then about a broad definition of a just transition. And a broad definition of a just transition isn't just about thinking about how you're moving from A to B. It's thinking very carefully about what B looks like. It's about thinking about how we change the system within which we are transitioning. So for example, in the energy sector, you could say we can have a transition, decarbonize the power sector, and as long as we make sure that everybody who worked in a coal-fired power station and a coal mine is taken care of, we achieve the just transition. But the bottom line is that, for example, in a country like South Africa, most households can't afford to pay for electricity. They can't afford to pay for the electricity they need to improve their lives. There's nothing in ensuring that the transition from A to B is equitable that will ensure that the destination is equitable, which is why we're finding it useful to think about a just transition as having two components. There's a journey and there's a destination. And we need to think about justice in both of those issues. And to date, we focused most of our attention in how the journey is going to be just. We don't think about the destination that we are going to. How do we ensure that we don't just decarbonize our electricity sector? How do we ensure that our electricity sector, in fact, generates equitable outcomes? How do we ensure that when we use more critical minerals in the development of renewables, that yes, we limit climate impact, but how do we ensure that we transition to a much more equitable system of trade and development in these areas? How do we move away from the previously extractive approach, which has in large part entrenched poverty and inequality in large parts of the world? So the first point I wanted to make is that I think it's really important that we start embracing a much broader definition of a just transition in a very comprehensive way, so that when we talk about the just transition in our NDCs, for example, and our adaptation plans, it isn't just about compensating people who have lost out, but about thinking proactively about how we move to a more equitable system. So how do we incorporate that broader definition of a just transition in our policies when we're looking at transition and change in critical mineral systems, in global value chains, in electricity sectors, in water sectors? Well, the first thing is I think we need to have a very good understanding of how the current system entrenches poverty and inequality. So I don't really like this word inclusion and inclusive value chains, because you can be made very poor and have your situation made very much worse by inclusion into a system. Small farmers are often included in systems, but they're worse off than they were before. Developing countries with mineral resources are included in value chains, but that inclusion doesn't necessarily deliver benefits. So it's useful then to think about a framework called adverse inclusion, which says that poverty and growth and pro-poor benefits don't arise simply from being included or excluded into a system. They arise from the terms on which you are included into a system. We need to have a much better understanding of how the terms of inclusion into a system entrench poverty and inequality, whether that is a local power sector or whether it is global value chains. How do we understand how the terms of inclusion drive inequality? And then if we are committed to this broader definition of a just transition, then policy needs to focus on how we make the terms of inclusion into those systems more equitable and more pro-poor, and whether that's intranation or across nations.
Yeah, Tracy, this the terms in which you are included is the tricky word in this part, because you can be included and be very, very bad in the end. This is very good. I've never thought of this issue in this concept, and I appreciate you bringing that forward. Dean, also as you work for Powershift, and also is involved in this just transition journey, let's say, as you are currently the senior just transition advisor at the Powershift Africa. So Dean, also I would love to hear your perspective and your thoughts on this just transition involved in critical minerals, always basing that if we are to mine, there is an issue. So how can we mitigate the issue? How can we make the most out of it?
Thank you very much. Apologies everyone again for coming in late. I came straight from the airport, but I'm happy to be here. As mentioned, my name is Bhebhe. I'm the senior advisor at Powershift Africa. Thank you for the most difficult question yet, but I'll try my best. I think when we look at the just transition question, it's a major tension, as you may all know. But we have to look at it from a south-to-south perspective and really look at it from tackling a deeper structural crisis. And by that, looking at it from an African lens, you have to recognize that Africa has got three structural deficiencies, essentially. One is a food crisis, right? The second is an energy crisis, which is why we've got 600 million people without energy access. And if we continue on this trajectory, we've got 720 million without energy access by 2030. The third is the export-import value model, essentially. By that, I think in short, we can just say Africa has become producers of what we don't consume, and we consume what we don't produce. And we now need to then look at this from including the different legacies of extractivism, unequal trade, and even the challenge of industrialization holistically. And how do we begin to think around reframing the idea around just transition from global south or south to south standpoint in a way we can emphasize structural economic transformation. So rather than just simply an energy substitution or leveraging those critical minerals as mentioned, how do we actually mindfully, instead of looking from impact measure, we look at it from a dignity point of reference. So how do we then look at the idea of reclaiming sovereignty of critical minerals? And I love the word critical minerals because essentially sometimes we think that it's critical minerals for Africa, it's critical minerals for the world. Because essentially Africa has those raw materials, essentially. So we've got the ability to be a key global player within the emerging green global economy, essentially, which is why it's critical to them. For us, we like to refer them as transition minerals, right? Because we want to do away with the bad and welcome the good, which is why the renewable energy developmental pathway is one way to look at how Africa can actually unlock its current and future developmental needs while really grounding on sustainability. Now, that being said, as mentioned around the sovereignty around critical minerals, rather than just continuing as exporters of raw materials or mineral-rich global south countries, we can really prioritize certain policies. So, for example, one of them will be adding local value, through refining, processing, and battery manufacturing. Now, this sounds super fantastic, but we also forget that because Africa is at the global of the value food chain, we do not have the necessary tech transfer to actually own that and actually be able to become renewable energy hubs, leveraging those transition minerals, right? The other aspect is local ownership. So most of the mines that we have are not locally owned, which is why it becomes quite problematic as well when we think about how to actually include people, or as people say, a socially democratically run, just transition, because it's an ownership issue as well. Now, the third aspect as well is where we sit in the global financial architecture. And I like to mention this because when Africa was birthed, essentially we were colonized, and we were colonized in something called the Bretton Woods system that was brought in, and that was done in 1945. There was no African country that was present and independent at that time. Now, if you look at it from that standpoint, we've continued to use that system of understanding how we receive money and also how money flows out of the continent, essentially. Now, in 1945, colonialism was rife, inequality was rife, and again, we are still living within that same system, right? We like to call them structural adjustment programs. And that's one idea that we need to look at, that why in the 21st century are we still sticking to financial systems that have essentially historically perpetuated inequality across the African continent. The other aspect, as mentioned, is leveraging state ownership and public-private partnerships in order to ensure a strategic control and reinvestment into national and developmental goals, right, essentially. We need the private sector to, I guess, in this instance, to de-risk, but again, that word is also problematic because Africa has become a risky market because we don't have our own African rating agencies. So how we are perceived in the investment world is through the eyes of individuals who do not have the deep experience of an African, essentially, but that is the reality. So we do need that sound and much more profound, robust public-private partnership. And also then, on that note, developing the idea around how we understand regional value chains through cooperation among southern countries. And when I say southern, I mean the global south. So because Africa has got the minerals, right, how do we then leverage those minerals through a south partner, for example, Brazil, like China, to leverage a technology transfer? But even beyond that, before we even think of the tech transfer when it comes to critical minerals, we don't have the skills as well, such that we are not yet ready as Africa to receive that tech transfer. And the first standpoint that we need to initiate will be a skills transfer to be ready for a technology transfer. But we do need a partner, right? Which is where Brazil can play a hand. This is where people like China as well can play a hand, essentially, and leverage Africa in order to become a green global power. Now, if we look at the stats already, we only have under 1% of renewable energy stored across the African continent. We've got potential of 8,625 gigawatts as a continent, and only under 60 has been installed totally. And that is underwhelming, right? And that comes to the idea of how we have not essentially come to a point where our ambitious needs as Africans is not being realized, right? We're putting a system that has been perpetuated by fossil fuel dependency as well. Essentially, that narrative around fossil fuels will unlock development for African countries. Yeah, maybe that might be true in the sense of the export model, right? But if you look at Nigeria, for example, they produce crude oil. Now, when you produce crude oil, you cannot convert that into this. You still need to refine it. Again, back to my first point, we don't have the refining processes. So we're going to sell that crude oil up in the market using Nigerian Naira, for example, right? And not taking into account the volatility of the currency exchange. So we've sold it for Naira, but we're buying it back in euros or US dollars, meaning that we're not buying it back. We're buying it back at a point where we're actually not breaking even as an economy, which is why Nigeria recently had to devalue its currency in order to keep up with the different structural changes that have happened in the emerging green global economy. Now, as a result of that, we're now further in more debt because we've then traded and not accounted for currency volatility and exchange rates. And as a result, we go back to the World Bank, for example, and borrow more money. Thus, the cycle continues, essentially. So, which is why the fossil fuel pathway is not essentially, unlocking development across the African continent. Nigeria's had fossil fuels for 50 years. This is one of the largest populations with no electricity in Africa right now. We've got in the Niger Delta, we're looking at people who are 41 years old in terms of life expectancy rate, which is one of the lowest in Africa, essentially. And this is what we call development, essentially, right? So we need to think of a new transformative strategy as Africans. Now, because we do not have the right means of implementation, when I say means of implementation, I mean the financing that should help us unlock that just transition that is needed. We need to now think around how we can leverage those critical minerals, which is why it's very important to be having those discussions, essentially, in order for us to be a powerhouse within that emerging global economy. But how do you also cheapen the idea around building out renewable energy hubs through local manufacturing? So despite the skills transfer, despite leveraging those critical minerals, despite the tech transfer, we do need renewable energy hubs that are set up in Africa in order for us to understand and actually lessen the costs around local manufacture, around whether it's wind turbines and solar panels. We might do right now, it's cheaper to buy a solar panel in India or in China or in Brazil than it is actually in Africa. Yet we actually have the silicon, copper, iron, essentially. That just speaks to the hypocrisy that we are grounded in, that structural crisis that we are embedded in, that is caught us in a cycle of precarity as a continent in our entirety. The other aspect that we need to also understand is looking at it from a free, prior, and informed consent perspective. Now, obviously, this idea is around inclusivity, which is something that we've been told we shouldn't use, which is quite valid, and thank you for the previous speaker for saying that. But I think it's looking from a perspective of how do we actually center dignity and distributed justice in our understanding of just transition and how we actually leverage critical minerals across the African continent. Now, because historically, We've seen different renewable energy projects going around across Africa. I think we're going to touch on Michigan a little bit later on. But one classic example is the wind Turkana project in Kenya. It's a massive wind project, right, essentially. But as a result of pursuing renewable energy, the result of pursuing a just transition, we recreated an extractive economic model because thousands of people lost their lands as a result of that. So there's this whole need of actually adopting an approach where we're using a bottom-up approach and including grassroots movements, including the people that are actually facing those crises, right? We don't have the people that don't have energy access in this room, right, to explain to us their struggles and their troubles. Then how do you expect to come up with a robust approach to address those crises, essentially? If we don't have the necessary people right here who've got leverage over the critical minerals, right? We don't have Zambians, they've got the copper, Zimbabwe because they've got the chromium, South Africa because they've got the lithium. We don't have those right representatives, including small artisanal miners in the room. How do we then come up with a robust green industrialization framework that is all inclusive for the people of Africa for us to unlock our developmental pathways? So it's quite essential, this whole idea of being centered around distributive justice and how we can analyze and welcome the idea of recreating a transformative economic model that is not extractive, that prioritizes people's needs, but at the same time marries that agenda with the history, the colonial history that Africa has. Now, remember, even if we do get the privatization, the de-risking, the skills transfer, the tech transfer, South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world already, right? We need to include and understand how we can come up with different social grants that can actually compensate and provide subsistence funding for people that actually cannot afford electricity within their homes. I think the concept around electricity or energy assets that people believe in just putting up poles or putting up coal plants or oil, for example, and not considering that because you have a pole does not necessarily mean transmission into a household as well, because some people genuinely do not have the ability to afford electricity or to pay for it, because unfortunately we live in a historically segregated, disadvantaged community that has not yet finished its process of reconciliation as a country, and that becomes quite important in these discussions to how to look at it from a holistic perspective in order to come up with that economic transformation that is very much needed. And again, I want to mention, artisanal miners become super important as well because that's an unregulated space. So how do we bring them onto the board and formalize them and put them up into a system that actually are acknowledged and their rights are recognized as well? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very detailed description of the situation, and also in your words. Within your words, I saw basically the basis for our next discussion, which is how to come up with a transformative outcome. I don't know exactly the expression you use, but another development model that goes out from or goes away from the traditional development model that we've been carrying on up to now, that led us to where we are here, for good or for bad, but we are here with the development model that is not coping both with climate urgency or climate actions and fighting inequality, not inclusion, inequality, fighting inequality. So we think and that the situation you described actually is not so different from the one we have in Brazil. So we do have a very unequal society as well. We do have basically our economy based on exports of raw materials, with some exceptions, it's true, but basically exports of agriculture, goods and commodities with very low added value. The critical minerals are coming like a very important topic to be discussed, and it's not for nothing that the G20 South African presidency chose critical minerals as one topic to be in the headlines of all the discussions and all the negotiations, is because without critical minerals, nothing is going to happen. So we do have leverage here. We do have a way of putting ourselves, including ourselves in a good term, and trying to get some of the supply chains of this added value to our continents, to our geographies. Especially because I read something this morning that Africa, this continent, will be for the next 50 years the place with young people. young people that will be the ones that will lead the world tomorrow. So how can we provide a better land for those young people? It's not, I'm not just here dreaming with a better world with sunshine, where the sun shines. We are actually thinking, how can we better negotiate our positions? And COP30 perhaps is a place where we can start to have, and here is the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Presidency of COP30. So have some negotiations around, some wording around a new consensus around the globe, a new Belém consensus that would lead us to rethink what is actually a good way to negotiate, a good way to place and rearrange the supply chains around the globe in a just way, in a more economically sound way. From emissions point of view, probably a better way, because you have renewables behind it. So this is the topic for our second conversation. Before we go for a coffee, a 5 minutes coffee, I just wanted to have 1 minute last words on this just transition and considering what we've discussed here. What are your what are your considerations for the second panel, for the second round table that we are going to have? Starting by you.
Thank you, Rosana. Yeah, I think that from this panel, if you take that from my perspective as a government official, there's a starting resemblance between that participation in Africa and and I think that the way to move forward is trying to do things together. I think that if we are to discuss global value chains and how developing countries can reinsert themselves in such chains, this gotta be done collectively. I think that if countries try to apply themselves to be a lot harder, and as you have said, we have the leverage, we have the resources, we can materialize all this potential into concrete actions. And I think that is most effort we're taking today here, doing these panels, and I think that those discussions may bear fruit. It depends on us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just through having read everybody's presentation, I think the first thing in my mind is South-South collaboration. Why are we working in silos? We have so many of our experiences are so similar. And we're tackling a big giant, so why not work together to tackle the giant, right? So working on ways as our fellow panelists, how do we still share? How do we help each other through achieving a more equitable global value chain? So I think collaboration and innovative thinking, for sure. Thank you.
So just to get back onto the topic of inclusion, and I think we understand development as inclusion versus exclusion, and that our goal is inclusion into value chains, whether you're a small farmer or whether you're a country. And what we need to do is take a step back and have a look at the terms under which the global south has always been included in those value chains on adverse terms. And the global north has always been included in those value chains on beneficial terms. And then really our challenge is about problematizing those terms of inclusion, taking a much closer look at what drives those terms of inclusion that end up being barriers to development.
Thank you. I think for me, last words is, I think it's beyond leveraging transition minerals. It's beyond unlocking a green industrialization policy. There are underlying historical issues across the African continent that need to be acknowledged. Otherwise, we are still going to continue recreating that economic model, right? We missed the boom in the 1980s and the 2000s as well when it came to the minerals. And we should use this opportunity that we have now to not sleep, right? Essentially, we are a sleeping giant, and I think now we're coming to a space and time where we can actually rise and be authentic to what it means to be African, and that means us leveraging the resources that we rightfully own and that we've got every right to also detect how we want those resources to be used and received by the rest of the world. Thank you.
So I invite everybody to have coffee and some refreshments, and we come back after the break, and I'll ask for also for the audience to start to come up with some ideas of solutions, and we will discuss here also some of our ideas that we could put together in a document as a result of this encounter here, of this discussion. So something pragmatic. I have one already that you mentioned and you mentioned, which is probably to see where we can share knowledge and do something practical about it. Meaning where Brazil can help tech transfer, where we can learn from you as well, because there are things that we should learn, but especially with one thing in mind, that we should not copy and paste what is being said to us, that is green technology. We should consider green technology, the things that are according to our realities. And here, for example, I challenge the hydrogen economy as the only thing in the world that will help us decarbonize the global atmosphere, something like that. Perhaps we do have other alternatives. I'm not excluding the hydrogen economy, but I'm saying that perhaps there are other alternatives that can also help, and it is more closer to our realities. It's closer to what we know in terms of technology, so the technology transfer is not so complicated. With that, I just leave it to the audience. Please, let's have our coffee and think, and now I'll revert to you after the break. How many? 10 minutes? of our discussion here. The idea here is to have a discussion around what can we do. Some ideas of implementation, some ideas of cooperation, some ideas of what to do or what not to do. So I think the result of this discussion would be a summary or a two-pager with some recommendations both for the G20 and for the COP presidency. Of course, we could think of continue working together after today to have a better document, or we can just end today and do a summary and send back to you, the audience, and the ones that are watching us over YouTube, so that we can produce some recommendations document that can be useful for us to foster what we've been discussing here, meaning a new development model or a new way of exploring our resources. This is exactly what the Belém Consensus is about. I really loved the way you framed, Tracy. If you can just give us an idea of what you talked about the inclusion and what is it that the Belém Consensus has to do with that. And what we thought the Belém Consensus, why Belém Consensus, just to give you guys an idea why we're talking that, is some kind of an opposition, or not an opposition, but another proposition for the Washington Consensus. My friend here was in Washington yesterday. So the Washington Consensus that led us to the globalization that somehow was good, somehow was bad. But after the Washington Consensus, what happened with our geographies is that a lot of wealth concentrated in the hands of few. And we turned from being, at least Brazil, being a reasonably industrialized country to a raw exporter of raw materials. So how can we change that situation is exactly what is behind the Belém Consensus. So what we think is that, especially considering critical minerals, when thinking the global supply chain, we should think not only in cost mitigation or what is the supply chain that leads to the least cost in the end of the product, but include in this reasoning also, is this supply chain organized in a way that mitigates emissions in terms of scope 2 and scope 3? Is this supply chain organized in terms that creates job and adds value closer to where the resources are? So if we do this three thinking, not only cost, but cost, emissions mitigation, and value added with jobs, quality jobs creation, then we would be arranging the supply chains in a way that would lead us to a more equitable world, equitable geographies. Within Brazil, for example, not only with northern countries, but also among regions in Brazil, the northeast and the southeast, they do have very different development stages. So even within Brazil, this would be some concept to be applied. So the Belém Consensus applied to the critical minerals is I think is the first step, because without critical minerals, we will not fight climate emergency. We will not have actually climate or green technologies. We do need critical minerals to go green. So this is the way to act together, is to take the thing that we have leverage on and propose a new way of using it. This is exactly what the Belém Consensus is about. And I would pass the word now for my fellow panelists here, just to come up with some ideas of cooperation, implementation, some ideas that what's the way forward. And then just after, I will ask the audience the same question, okay? Oh, and thank you. And for those that are interested, with this QR code here, you have access to a fact sheet that we produce, bringing some of the information we gather around the Belém Consensus. Just to give you some of the ideas that is behind it, not exactly concerning critical minerals, with other supply chains. For example, if instead of exporting iron ore, or talking about critical minerals, instead of exporting iron ore, Brazil is the third largest, the second or the third largest producer of iron ore. So instead of exporting that in a very basic way without benefiting the iron ore, if we go from there to export green pig iron, for example, we can triple the value of the ton of the mineral, of the steel that we are, of the green, not even steel, the pig iron. So this is what we're talking about. When you add value closer to where the resources are, first, you help the world to decarbonize, and second, you create quality jobs, and this is wealth distribution. In the silicon supply chain, for example, this is going from exporting metallurgical silicon by $4 per kilo to export probably polysilicon by $90 per kilo. So this is what we're talking about, is bringing more closer to where the resources are, the value chain. So I'll start by you, Gerson, with some ideas, and then after you, I ask the audience the same question.
Thank you so much. Just to frame the conversation within the Berlin consensus, I think starting point collaboration between the South-South. I think if we look at, for example, if we look at within the context of Brazil and South Africa, what we can do is we can collaborate on community-led transition planning. So a bottom-up approach. Let's train our communities. Let's teach them how to be more aware. What is this just, like we need to tell them what the just transition is so that they understand, and that advocacy on the ground level up can really influence that, especially from two countries coming together with that same approach. Two, I would use a personal example within our organization. We actually have an app. It is called the AMAP app. So it's an Africa Mining Accountability app. So this app allows communities to report any kind of violations, any type of environmental, social violations that are caused by mines. So if we can collaborate, for example, with Brazil on a global platform of that nature, that could also work and will lead us to more solidarity. So those are some ideas that we can start off with.
Well, COP30 is taking place in Brazil, and that's, I think, reason for great joy among us. And this proposal of the Berlin consensus, I understand that it is still under construction, and of course, the Brazilian government the Brazilian government expects a great outcome coming from the COP30. And what I think we're discussing here, and it's very interesting, is that we're talking about South cooperation and how we can be responsible for our own destinies and not having foreigner voices telling us what to do. And I think that the choice of delay is like a paradigm for this discussion, because when we think that last year Joe Biden was the first sitting president to visit the Amazon, it was 2024. And Macron was the first French president to go to the Brazilian Amazon. The Brazilian Amazon is the largest border of France, and no previous French president has been there. And I think that is to say, we need to think by ourselves, and also I think that people who are very concerned about climate change, obviously, we are facing a climate emergency, but they need to be brought to the reality of the people who are being affected. As we have discussed it today by mining, for example, because sometimes you have many people discuss the effects of mining in local communities, but they don't know these local communities. And that's what we absolutely hope that will take place at the COP. And eventually, with the proposal of the Berlin consensus, is an idea not only from the South, but from all countries that can benefit and address the emergencies faced by all countries.
So now I'm not the moderator here, I'm also a panelist. So some practical ideas, and I go from your point, okay, considering that we are taking into account the communities, because this is like basic stuff. And just if I may, I was in Dubai hearing to a big mining company describing their mines, and I asked about adding value or if they are worried of bringing value to the company, and the answer was, yeah, our mines is according to ESG. So this is actually what they should do as human being, not a discussion on climate discussion. This is your obligation as a big company. Anyhow, this is not the discussion that we should have. I mean, I'm going from where you mentioned, but I think for each critical mineral that we consider very key for our economies, here for South Africa, there are a bunch of them, but I'll take just the manganese example. For Brazil, probably niobium, lithium, and others. So for each of those critical minerals, including iron ore, we should find where is the sweet spot for us to be in the global supply chain. What is the sweet spot? In the steel making, for example, is it betting only on steel plates, or can we position ourselves in an intermediate point so that we can get some money from there, better money, and then with that money finance the rest? So for each supply chain involving each of the critical minerals, I think one thing that we could do in a practical way is to find our countries to find where's the sweet spot for us to be in, and fight for that sweet spot in negotiations around the globe. So this is one idea. We will not be able to do that for all critical minerals. We should choose probably 3 or 4 or 1 or 2, it depends, and find where we want to be. Once we define where we want to be, then the pathway to there is kind of clear, and we will know what to do. The worst we can do is just fight blindly for our rights without knowing where we want to be. So this is my 2 cents here. Tracy here.
I think instead of focusing on particular details of individual value chains, but rather I think it's very important that we think about the broad overarching policy framework within these take place. And I think it's very important that we problematize the current system in a certain way. We understand development fundamentally as expanding global value chains and being included in global value chains. That's how industrial policy is often framed. The country wants to be included in global value chains and to participate in global value chains. And we need to problematize that so that our policy goal should be to work together to fundamentally change the terms of inclusion into these value chains, so that our goal is not about inclusion or exclusion, it's about recalibrating the terms under which particularly developing countries are included into value chains, and looking for a new deal around that. And I think that there's a way to include climate issues in the same way as a participant in the value chains by adding a temporal element to value chains. So when we think about the terms of inclusion for participants in equity and fairness, we need to think about the way in which future generations are included into those value chains and the implications for them and whether the terms of inclusion are fair for them. But I think it's important that we fundamentally problematize the system. Otherwise, you keep getting these kind of little incremental concessions at the margins, which don't fundamentally change things. Yes, we can focus on the details and how we work together. But we essentially need a completely different kind of framework that recognizes that it's the terms of inclusion into value chains that are entrenching poverty and inequality. And that's not going to change until those terms of inclusion change fundamentally.
Thank you. So I think for me, practical steps or ways to really troubleshoot this idea is we first need to look at it as not a mitigation aspect, it's an adaptation aspect. You know, the Global South is not trying to manage emissions, for example, we're trying to avoid them, which is why it's critical to create a framework where we're able to avoid emissions. Now, the other aspect is we need to be allowed to, for example, if we're to leverage our transition minerals, right, and we get to sell them in our local currencies, surely we are meant to buy them back as finished products, right, in our local currencies as well, essentially. We don't need to have a system where in order for me to get a solar panel, I have to use US dollars or euros, for example, right? So how do we then empower our local currencies? But then another idea would be ideally how do we create a new non-circular currency that is backed by Africa's critical minerals, essentially, in order for us to leverage ourselves within the emerging global economy, right? The other aspect is we need to create a framework that acknowledges the debt that is being faced across the African continent. Most countries are currently servicing 67% against their GDP, leaving under 35% to infrastructure, to health, to energy, to any fundamental block that you would describe as development. And that on its own is also quite problematic. So how do we look at, for example, the PREMIER implementation, not as funding innovation, but funding and empowering people, right, to unlock the developmental needs that we currently need as the Global South. The other aspect is how do we create a knowledge base and a knowledge platform? You know, Africans or the Global South can come up with its own solutions, right? If we look at the different initiatives that have gone about across the world, they've come out of Washington, DC, they've come out of London. You know, we do not have a space where Africans or people in the Global South are coming up with solutions for ourselves, right? If I had a report right now from the University of Oxford and a report from the University of Sao Paulo, for example, speaking on just transition, I'm sure half of us are going to pick up the University of Oxford one first, right? And that speaks to us having the need to start validating each other that we actually have the skills, we actually have the necessary people who've got the ability to usher us to the next level, right? We do not need other people to think on our behalf because we surely 100% can. I think we all probably have degrees in this room, essentially, right? But we have not been given a place at the table and considered as experts and academics who can actually come up with solutions on our own. So how do we turn this into something that's not designed by the global north, but something that's designed and rooted in community, right? How do we actually then create aspects that are not only just data rich, but they're also trust rich, right? Because we're told so many times how bad the situation is in the Global South, but we're not given the trust to actually come up with the right developmental pathways to empower us as well. And that's the problem that we're rooted in currently. So how do we look at it from a context of not just implementing frameworks, but how do you also center it on dignity, on justice, but also at the same time acknowledging the historical differences that we face as the Global South to come up with a transformative agenda that can actually empower people in the long run. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim. This validating among ourselves, believing in what we have is kind of key. I don't know about South Africa, but at least in Brazil, we do have some way, we always find that the things that comes from abroad is better than ours. This historically has been like that, with some exceptions, of course, but this kind of mentality also traps us in the same vicious circle of trying to mimetize technologies that are not suitable to our realities as the technology to be adopted, and sometimes in not regarding even the environmental aspects of that technology or even the cost of that technology, and imposing more debts, more money to do so. So thank you so much for your insights. We are taking notes of the insights. So now, who wants to make a question, a proposition, or, yeah, I'll be, yeah, do you? And please say your name and organization, okay?
Of course. Thank you so much for a wonderful panel and very insightful conversation so far. I'm Bilal Bisiri from the Center for African and Near East Studies. I know we've been focusing a lot on the structural limitations when problematizing the issue so far, but I would like to just shift the focus a little bit on some of the transient geopolitical developments, geoeconomic developments, such as the Trump policies and etc. I know this is something we may have wanted to avoid in this conversation, but I'll keep it on kosher at the safe side. Don't worry. So the scope for upstream value retention addition in resource-rich countries economies faces, yes, structural constraints, but also external shocks to the system, right? So the Trump tariffs are an example, but they don't only externalize the adjustment costs onto developing economies, but also penalize economies or countries that are attempting to localize value through beneficiation or industrial policy measures. So countries that are already in crisis mode, and we're not going to name any, will be coerced into deal-based diplomacy, transactional, leveraging their security for minerals, which creates new dynamics which challenge a block-based diplomacy which we're trying to communicate and propose right now. So via the AU or G20 platforms, it becomes more difficult to coordinate the shared conditionalities that assert policy space for beneficiation while buffering against retaliatory trade measures imposed by dominant states. For instance, the United States, but in the future it could be anyone else, right? Now, gloomy, yes, of course, it creates challenges, but we are looking at long-term positioning to create this resilience. So, possible solutions to this, I would humbly put forward, is a South-South critical minerals compact, which should start from that position. And we have these institutions that can enable us to open these conversations, such as BRICS, the African Union, or others. So develop an African Union endorsed compact with enforceable norms for this value addition and supply chain localization across member states. The other one, because we are G20 thematically bound and T20 conversation here, is to advocate for an exemption regime or compensatory framework under G20 processes to shield developing countries from retaliatory tariffs linked to climate-aligned industrial policy. Finally, and this is something that Dean already has spoke about, is shared risk pools. So we need to design cooperative insurance risk pools, example under African Bank or the New Development Bank or the BRICS Development Bank, to buffer policy risk for states enforcing beneficiation mandates. This helps create resilience to the system from any external shocks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Noted. Anyone else? Ideas, solutions? Yeah. Your name and organization, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Greenpeace Africa, and last year I had the pleasure to work with the UNSG panel on critical transition minerals. So I know the importance of justice and equity embedded in the minerals discussion. My intervention is more on improving what already exists in terms of global blocks. So the BRICS Plus countries, I think that's a very big moment to shift. And the inclusion of countries like Argentina, if it's lithium, inclusion of countries like Iran as well, this is going to really shift that narrative and improve what is already there. So I think that's a very critical moment to really carry that momentum into COP30, but also to then within that group of countries also address China, for instance, reliance on renewables, but also how it's interacted with countries like Indonesia, like Argentina in the past. So really embedding justice within the BRICS as well. I think that's something very important as well, just to ensure that there's justice and equity within the BRICS Plus. So that's just one already existing solution that I think instead of creating something new, let's leverage on something that's coming, considering the power that the global supply chain will have within the BRICS plus countries. I think that's a very big moment that we can't overlook. And the fact that Brazil is leading that work, I think that's something very important.
Yep. And South Africa is leading the G20. Yep.
Hi, everybody. Gillian Hamilton from South African Civil Society. I usually complain because my civil society colleagues only know how to complain and say no and can't think of solutions. And that's exactly what I'm thinking about today, is that I don't know much about critical minerals, so I'm trying to get my head around this. But one of the challenges that I see is very much a governance challenge in Africa. And I will use the example, and don't repeat this to my fellow South Africans, but South Africa is a very good example of bad governance. So we have a mining rehabilitation fund, and yet that money has gone missing. And so we aren't rehabilitating the mines and doing the environmental things that we should be doing. The other big issue that comes up, and I was talking to the ambassador from Congo Brazzaville, was about illicit financial flows. So there's even, I'm also quite pragmatic. So even if we're doing all these things, these minerals, you cannot measure them, you cannot figure out, maybe there's a great AI or a tech solution to this, but we don't know how much is actually leaving or being processed or going some places. And so there's so little control and governance of this. And I'm wondering how we find solutions for that. And then the other issue, even when we talk about South-South negotiations, one of the things that comes to mind for me is the power dynamic. So even within South-South, how do we make sure these negotiations are fair? Because even within us, and let's be honest, so China's really strong and they hold a lot of our debt in Africa. I won't say in other countries, but how do we make sure that we have fair negotiations, even in a South-South perspective? And so it's just, I'm sorry, I really know very little about this. So I'm trying to get my head around what the solutions could be, thinking about these as some of the challenges.
Well, by pointing out the challenges, there are points that we should take into consideration when thinking about solution. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
For their remarks. My name is Adrian Joseph. I'm the Critical Minerals Fellow at South African Institute for International Affairs. I think with regards to extracting value from our critical minerals, I'd say there's two things. The first thing applies to our strategy at home. So if you look at the G20 countries, most of the Western countries already have a critical mineral strategy. Australia, Canada, yet for many countries in the global south that are seeking to extract value from their minerals or value addition, there's no clear plan. A plan is important, or critical mineral strategy, an explicit one, is important because it signals to investors, because we have to recognize that private sector multinational mining companies are the ones who determine where value is created in minerals. You can't affirm a mine into existence. We have to recognize that a plan is important to signal to the market that we, as the state or as government, that we have a plan to address the issues that they cite for not investing in our mining jurisdictions, for not investing in refining capacity. South Africa is a good example. South Africa is an established mining jurisdiction, but exploration spend in South Africa has been on the decrease for multiple years. Some people say South African mining sector is in structural decline. That's because mining and refining minerals is very energy intensive. And this is a country with load shedding. I just come from load shedding elsewhere in Pretoria. That's the first thing. So at home, we need a plan, an explicit critical mineral strategy. And we can do interesting things in that plan. For example, the Minister for Mines in South Africa has referred to coal as a critical mineral. I don't know what you think about that, but he spoke at the mining indaba about moving away from Western understandings of criticality. So sometimes we'll hear minerals referred to by different names, critical, green, transition. They're not semantic differences. They reflect how different countries understand the minerals differently. Western countries are driven by anxieties on overdependence on China, and so they see it through a security supply dependence lens. And we've seen this now as the minerals for security agreements. Whereas we in the Global South see it primarily as a renewable energy value addition, hence for example, the African Union doesn't like critical minerals, it likes to refer to as green minerals. Then having a plan for a foreign policy plan. So we have a plan at home, what's our plan for abroad? We have to recognize that because of the globally interconnected nature of mineral supply chains, that what we do is constrained by what others are doing elsewhere. And so we have to have a good understanding about what the EU are doing, what the United States are doing, and what China are doing on critical minerals. Because if you want to leverage these critical minerals, what we're essentially doing is we are appealing to Western anxieties about China dependence on Chinese mineral value chains, and we're saying you can friendshore or onshore in our country as a way of improving the security of supply chains. So we need to understand not only our own strategy at home, but we need to understand what others are doing. And to that end, I would say that the best strategy, in my opinion, for countries in the Global South is to adopt a kind of, I don't want to use the word non-alignment, because that's baggage in South Africa, but I want to talk about strategic neutrality. Looking at different countries who are coming to extract minerals in Africa and elsewhere in the Global South, and saying, looking at the different partners and saying, we want to work with the one that gives us the best deal in terms of the goals and objectives that we want, in terms of value addition, in terms of green industrialization. So in conclusion, that's what I'd say. At home, we need a plan, and in terms of foreign policy, we need to exercise strategic neutrality to be able to leverage our minerals. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and this is more or less what I was, sorry, what's your name?
Adrian.
Adrian, sorry. This is more or less what we were talking here. To find the sweet spot is more or less having a plan. Where can I be there? What can I offer? How can I be neutral and at the same time do a more specific plan to my reality? So, and also a lot of the countries, they do have plans for their critical minerals, but those plans were done and developed within another reality, economic reality, climate reality, and now tariff reality. Sorry, I didn't want to bring this in here, but at least we do have a new world coming to knock at our doors soon. So probably those plans that you mentioned will also have to be somehow reviewed, because they will not be sustainable probably in this new reality that is coming. And secondly, just to finish my intervention here, is there is one variable that is different from what happened in the past, is the climate change. This is something that people may deny, people may want to go around it, but the countries that prepare themselves first to be able to supply the world with green technology, and by green technology, I'm not saying only the technologies that are common sense, like electric vehicles. I'm not saying that. I mean, green technology meaning your contribution to a green supply chain. So those countries that can position themselves first as green and able to supply a lesser emissions feedstock, those countries will be the ones that will lead this new world that's coming. This is not thinking, this is pure reality. I mean, the world is not going to be tomorrow, the world that we need up to now, I think. Anyone else? So, you two, and then I think we have to wrap up.
Wrap it up. Hi, my name is Rosana Makoka. Can you? Hi, my name is Rosana Makoka. Also also from the civil society space. I was thinking I was going to come here and just listen because I'm not an economist. My background is in investment, but I've worked with mining and affected community. And I really liked what Mr. Bhebhe was saying about the historical context of where we are. And I like what Dr. Ledger was saying about, how do we define what is just? And what is just is closely linked to power. And at the end of the day, mining affected communities have no power in relation to mining companies. And so as much as we need to build consensus about collaboration, we need to be mindful and be realistic about actors acting in self-interest and there having to be a right to recourse. I mean, yes, Gerson's right, we have all these labor rights and community rights and environmental rights, but what good are those rights if communities do not have the means to enforce those rights? So, I mean, there are two basic requirements for protecting people. Number one, we need a strong and independent judiciary. I was actually shocked. The UN Special Rapporteur for the Independence of Judges obviously sits in Geneva. She came to the University of Pretoria now in April. And she did a whole day workshop on just what's happening in Africa. And I was shocked at the extent to which you cannot necessarily expect to get a just outcome going to courts in this continent, right? So even if we have these standards, if there are violations of those standards, what remedies are there? Right? And the second thing we need an access to justice fund. Because communities and public interest law firms do not have the resources to litigate every violation. Like, it's great that you're identifying violations, but those need to be litigated in order for there to be accountability. And litigation costs money. And so I feel it needs to be built into these agreements. Access to justice and independent judiciary, the requirements need to be built into these standards.
My name is Senya Namo. I'm an associate professor of economics at the University of South Africa. And I had a lot of interest in environmental economics and natural resource economics. So coming from an institution of higher learning, I have picked that much of the discussion really tailors towards capacity development, skills transfer. And so I think one of the outcomes of this policy dialogue, which I consider to be groundbreaking in terms of the focus on critical minerals, there's a growing interest globally in carrying out research to provide solutions for these critical minerals. We see there's a lot of growth in literature that focuses on mineral nationalism. So a number of countries have actually restricted trade, totally blocking exports. For instance, we see Indonesia putting a ban on nickel exports. Zimbabwe has also put a ban on lithium exports. We know the dangers of having this complete shutdown and focusing on resource nationalization, as it tends to fragment the markets, the global value chains, and it leads to price volatility and many other aspects that can actually, if you look at the bigger picture, affect even these particular countries. So whilst there's a move towards that minerals nationalism, without a strategy on how to then further develop these sectors, then I think we are lost. And so just to be brief, I think my intervention here is to say the higher education sector is uniquely positioned to leverage on this need for research in this particular sector. So I want to propose that going forward, we consider developing a community of practice with experts on critical minerals research. I see a significant number of experts in this room who can actually take this further. So we need more policy dialogues where we deliberately create a platform for knowledge exchange. And so one of the things that can be done is to immediately think of critical research areas based on the discussion that came out today. I liked it when Bhebhe came in, although he was a bit late, but you clearly told us about the problems. I think I've noted the issue of the ownership structure of our mines. You also touched on the global financial architecture that puts us in a difficult position. The issue of de-risking is renewable energy investments, the role of public-private partnerships, and I see those as critical research focus areas that we can already focus on, strategize, issue calls for papers, inject funding into research to really have a path where we can find solutions, specifically focusing on critical minerals. Thank you.
So thank you so much. I think this is after her wrap up of what we discussed here. I just want to thank each of my fellow panelists here. I'll pass the mic for you to just to give one final 2 words, and we come to an end of our discussion. We will be making like a summary of all the discussions that we had here, and we will share the summary, and hopefully this summary will be like a recommendations paper or something to be presented to some authorities or to some of negotiators, because some very great ideas and very great diagnosis and analysis were discussed today. So I'll start by you, Gerson, and then for you, Tracy, and you, okay?
So just in closing, I think today's sessions have been really insightful. Just to see how many experiences like globally are very similar, especially within the global south. In this case, it's Brazil. A lot of our experiences are really the same. So I'm walking out of here once again. Why are we working in silos? We have so much power that we don't seem to tap into. And I think all of us do understand what this transition wants to be for Africans. We see the opportunity, and through the conversation, the hunger to want to change it for the South, for us, right? It's definitely here. I am definitely feeling encouraged, and I'm hopeful, because these are very great and innovative ideas that we've discussed. And it's a great step forward, and I'm grateful to have been a part of the conversation. So thank you.
Well, I think that perhaps the best way to sum up what was discussed today, according to our perspective, is that we hope that all these discussions and different points of view may be brought to COP30, and then we can bear like fruit and have positive outcomes and results, and that's what we all hope and believe.
I mean, I think we can all agree that the world is changing. And the response I see, a lot of the response is about trying to stop it from changing and keep it the way it is. We should want the world to change. We should want it to change fundamentally. But this is the gap in which our version of change can be substituted. And I think it's a global moment that we shouldn't miss. And instead of saying, let's try and get things back to normal, to say, but normal's never worked for us. We need a fundamentally different system. So let's seize on this momentum to move ourselves towards that goal?
Right, two quick things. Number one is, Adrian, I think your inputs were really amazing, and I think for me it's how do we come up with an Africa taxonomy, start categorizing all these things, right? And we need to also define what renewable energy is in Africa. I don't think the National Energy Regulatory Authority actually has a definition for what renewable energy is, right? And it opens up spaces for things like green coal, and that is actually the thing now, right? Essentially, and that's the world that we're living in. And the second and last thing is, I think we need to also bear in mind African Carbon Markets Initiative. Right? I think that's very problematic. It's a false narrative. And I'll leave you these words that imagine already Africans sold portions of their land, and that is also now resold again for a greater price by whoever was the purchaser. But imagine an idea where we're not leveraging, but they use the African carbon markets to actually purchase land that has got lithium and manganese, and again becomes an ownership issue all over again. So we need to stay away from false solutions. We think how we want to understand and leverage Africa for our development. Thank you.
So with this, our discussion comes to an end. Next week, no, the week after, we will have the launch of the Brazilian taxonomy. We do have this crazy thing as green coal being tried out there as well. So I sympathize with your green coal observation. And hopefully this will bring some more reasonable way of looking into renewables and what is green. And thank you so much for all of you for being here. It was a wonderful discussion for the audience, wonderful ideas, everything noted. Thank you, Ambassador. It was a great pleasure to be here. Bye-bye.